Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. I am welcoming all of you to this conversation with this amazing panelist. And I'm already thanking you because this is a great success. It is wonderful to see so many familiar faces and unfamiliar faces around this important topic for people interested in what's happening with our little island that is being under siege and is being attacked. And so the big thank you to Casa Salvador Allende for putting this together. It's allied El Grupo Guillermo González, the Socialist Project, and the Canadian-Cuban Friendship Association for coming together and making this event possible. Now I want to turn to our panelists. We have Nicolas Avendaño Ruiz, member of the Canadian-Cuban Friendship Association and member of the Toronto Executive Committee. We have Keith Bolender, is that how you pronounce it? Author of several books and freelance journalist living in Toronto, who has written extensively on Cuban matters for a variety of North American publications. He is also a lecturer on American foreign policy and the Cuban Revolution. And we have Sharmini Peries. She is a journalist and co-founder of the Analysis News and former senior editor and co-founder of the Real News Network. Every panelist will have between 10 and 15 minutes, maximum 15 minutes. And it is a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. Thank you very much. And we'll start right here on my right with Nicolas.
Thank you for attending, for being present at this event. As most of you are familiar, or might not be familiar, Cuba is going through quite a hard time right now. It's going through probably one of its most difficult times. Some have even described it even worse than the so-called special period. For those of you who are not aware of what the special period is, it's the period pretty much at the end of the 80s and throughout the 90s. When the socialist bloc was overthrown and Cuba was pretty much left isolated in terms of economics and trade, and went through quite a crucial time. So I guess I want to speak a little bit about like solidarity in general in Canada. The current blockade and the effects that it has on the Cuban people is, I think, one of the most atrocious crimes that the United States is currently committing. I mean, on top of the other atrocious crimes that they commit on a daily basis throughout the world. It's a blockade that's been going on for over 65 years, and I think some of the other panelists will be speaking on the history of the blockade, so I'm not going to get too into it. But the blockade and the point of the blockade, mainly, some call it an embargo, some call it the sanctions regime and all that. It's a blockade. That's the language that we like to use. The point of it is to cause as much misery and trouble for the Cuban people as possible in an attempt to overthrow the socialist government in Cuba. This is not, us as ideologues, this is what we're saying. This isn't a stated fact of the United States government from its own internal documents, which have been released, that clearly show that the point of the blockade is to overthrow the revolution, to bring as much misery to the Cuban people so that they blame socialism for their problems. And this is kind of what we've been seeing throughout. Canada, I mean, to speak about the relationship between Canada and Cuba. Canada has had unbroken relations with Cuba for the past 80 years. It's one of the two countries that didn't break relations with Cuba, in our hemisphere, I mean, and the other one's Mexico. So Mexico and Canada have had the longest unbroken relations with Cuba. folks who are older might remember Pierre Trudeau famously visiting Cuba. I believe it was in the 70s. And again, Canada has always had very fruitful relations, have always been for the benefit of both countries. Cuba currently has relationships with Canadian mining companies that help develop their mining industry in Cuba. But Cuba solidarity has been going on in Cuba regarding the revolution has been going on since the 60s. We have some folks in CCFA who have been involved with the Cuba Solidarity movement, and were founding members of Cuba Solidarity in the 1960s. CCFA specifically was founded in 1977 as part of an initiative, to bring together folks who were in solidarity with Cuba, with the Cuban Revolution, and with the Cuban people, and a desire to see a strengthening of ties between the Canadian people and the Cuban people. So part of our the work that we do as part of CCFA is to come to events like this and educate the Canadian people and folks here specifically in Toronto regarding what's going on in Cuba, education on Cuba, how things operate in Cuba, from government to healthcare to schools. And so we're here doing a lot of that work. We have, and folks will be able to see at our table, we have rallies at the end of every month, every last Sunday of the month. So actually tomorrow, so all of you are aware, no one can say that they don't know about the event. Tomorrow we are having a rally right across the street from the United States Consulate on University Avenue. That's 361 University Avenue. We have it every last Sunday of the month, and we're gathered there for an hour. So it's not that long, but we're there to show people that there are those out there who care about Cuba, who understand who is responsible for what's going on in Cuba right now, and to demand that the Canadian government do something about it, to defend Cuba, to defend the sovereignty of Cuba. And this is very crucial right now, especially with everything that's going on in the world, from Trump's threats against Canada, to the US attacks on other sovereign nations like Venezuela, like Iran, like the threats, like the current military, like the threats of invasion of an island that has never, ever attacked the United States, that has never had any type of terrorism planned by the government against the United States, even though the United States continuously puts Cuba on the spurious list of state sponsors of terrorism. So it's really important that that we are gathered here today to learn a little bit more about Cuba. Some of the other initiatives that we have regarding Cuba Solidarity is our many drives, our collection drives for donations. We usually purchase goods, food, imperishable food that we can send to Cuba, medical supplies. We send quite a lot of medical supplies. And recently a lot of energy equipment. Again, due to the tightening of the blockade, the threat of sanctions against any country that provides oil to Cuba. Again, how is that something that we can allow to happen in today's day and age? To allow one country to completely blockade another country from the very necessary energy needs. Everything runs on oil in Cuba. And I'll speak a little bit now about the Che Brigade, and I think it's very important that I speak about it right now, because that's another initiative that we have. It's actually originally, it was originally like a thing that was on its own, but then we adopted it later on in the 90s, and that's the Che Guevara Brigade. So we have a volunteer brigade that goes every end of April, beginning of May, to Cuba. And right now, today, we actually have a brigade that's arriving in Cuba right now. And it's a lot of young people. It's one of the largest brigades we've actually sent. It's over 45 people. So over 45 people from all different corners of life. We've had people in the past from high school going, elderly folks from the universities, teachers, labor unionists, indigenous people, folks who are migrant workers, like people who are here in Canada who want to know and learn more about Cuba in a way that you won't in, let's say, just going for tourism. And that type of initiative helps us actually interact and learn from the Cuban people. We've been to schools, we've been to universities, we've been to hospitals. We've also done a lot of the nice parts of going to Cuba, which is going to the beaches and trying out the food, learning more about the culture. There's actually, and I could sit here and talk to y'all about Cuba the entire night, but just like a little bit, they have centros culturales. Casa de la Cultura is what they call it. It's a house of culture. It's basically a free space and it's open to all the members of the community, where they have dancing lessons and how to learn how to play instruments. It's basically like anything that you can think of that is cultural in any way, shape, or form. The Casa de la Cultura, that's the space for it, and it's for everyone in the community to enjoy for free because the government essentially funds it. And this is the type, and again, this isn't like one of the greatest achievements, but look at our society. How many of our communities would benefit from that type of institution? How many young people? These are the types of things that we have, that we can see in Cuba. And the types of things of the knowledge of which we want to bring to Canada, to show people that in Cuba there is something different going on. Something that's worth learning about, something that's worth defending, something that's worth fighting for. The Cubans, and I mean, I can go on for a little bit longer, but the Cubans have done so much, and again, we'll probably hear a bit more from the other panelists regarding what Cuba has done. But from going out and sending their sons to die in the fight against apartheid, to sending doctors and teachers around the world to cure and to teach. And just the development, the amazing developments that have come out of the Cuban biomedical industry. Actually, recently, and I highly recommend, there's a documentary that's going to come out from Belly of the Beast. It's called Teresita's Dream, and it's actually about a treatment that Cuba is currently developing that's showing incredible signs of success, and it's a treatment for Alzheimer's. I highly recommend folks, if you can have access to it, please watch it. A lot of us actually saw it last year when we went to Cuba. It was the grand premiere we went to, and we actually got to speak to the woman, Dr. Teresa. She's the one who actually started developing it because of what was going on with her mother. And it's very moving what's going on in Cuba, and Canadians can learn a lot from the Cuban system, from the priorities that the Cuban state has when it comes to where to invest our money. And it's quite sad that in this time of trouble, Cuba, which has even sent doctors, I believe they sent doctors to Manitoba or something, but Canada has received help from Cuba in many things. And the fact that the Canadian government has been dragging its feet when it comes to aid, promising $8 million in aid, which yes, it's not a minuscule number, but compared to the the amount of money that's going to to wars and militarization, it leaves much to be desired, especially a country that consistently calls itself a defender of human rights and a defender of international law. I think Canada should show some backbone and be able to say we stand up for Cuba as we stand up for the sovereignty of any other nation in our hemisphere against any attack from any country. We should stand in solidarity with the Cubans, as the Cubans have stood in solidarity with us. I think I'll end with one phrase. It's very popular in Cuba, and it's by the amazing founding father of Cuban revolutionariness, Jose Marti. Jose Marti, and his phrase is actually embodied. It lives on in every Cuban, and you see it everywhere in Cuba, and it's kind of a maxim that they live by. And it's patria es humanidad. The homeland is humanity. And that's how Cubans think of the solidarity that they do, and I think it should show us how we should conceive of solidarity as well. For them, all of humanity is something that they want to help protect, and that is why they invest so much in sending teachers out to many of the poorest corners of the world. Same thing with doctors. All of these programs are currently under attack. They're fighting against apartheid. Their industry for to develop medicine and treatments for things that, and to be able to offer that to its citizens and to people in other countries of the world. And lastly, like the COVID vaccines that they were able to develop, 3. So that shows us how we should be in solidarity. And I think I'll end with this. For me, solidarity isn't a feeling that you have. It's not something that you write on a piece of paper that says, I have solidarity with you. Solidarity is an action. And how can you show solidarity? Join the CCFA Toronto. There's other Cuba Solidarity groups. If you're a member of any group, you can join the CNC, the Canadian Network on Cuba. They're always accepting member groups to join and be part of the movement for solidarity with Cuba so that we can truly show them that we care. But I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's a great turnout. It's so nice to see so many people. Thank you for the organizers. Thank you for everyone here. My name is Keith Bolender. I'm an author of a number of books on Cuba-American relations. And tonight I am going to talk about what's happening between the United States and Cuba with a bit of a historical perspective. So we all know how bad things are in Cuba right now. Trump's blockade on oil is making things so much worse. The blackouts, the shortages, the suffering of the Cubans that they are enduring. So as a quick aside, Trump's illegal war against Iran is causing fuel shortages in Europe and Asia, with countries starting to ration oil and gas. Hospitals are restricting hours of operation due to blackouts, prices are rising, and the people are starting to struggle. Welcome to Cuba's world. Besides the oil blockade, there's been some talk about the potential of an American military intervention on the island. It wouldn't be the first time, the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and the US was making plans for a second invasion in 1962, which is one of the reasons why the Cubans installed the nuclear weapons, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There does seem to be some credible reporting of planning for invasion, but I seriously doubt it'll happen. So the US is giving all sorts of mixed signals about Cuba, including those reports of plans for a military invasion, with Trump saying Cuba will be easy to take over. And a year ago, our favorite Cuban American, Marco Rubio, came out strongly in favor of regime change. But recently, he seems to be changing his position a little bit. From demanding the Cuban government surrender unconditionally, as he did in early 2025, Marco then changed his attitude 2 months ago when he insisted Cuba make fundamental economic changes. It's nice to know he's now the president of Cuba. 11 days after that, he said, quote, Cuba needs to change. And you don't need to change everything at once. It doesn't have to change from one day to the next. Everyone here is mature and realistic. Sounds quite reasonable, but no one should trust what he or Trump says about Cuba. Since then, Havana has actually instituted some new economic policies, not because of Marco's rantings, including allowing Cuban Americans to invest directly into private companies. But of course, that makes no difference. Whatever changes Cuba makes won't be good enough. The punishment will continue until the Americans decide when to stop it, even to the point of returning to the pre-revolutionary days of when the United States decided who was ruling Cuba. However, I do think the shift in Rubio's perspective is a result of the fact that Cuban government did not collapse during the past year as a result of the increased US hostilities. The US has been waiting for the revolution to fall for a very long time, and I'll comment on that a little later. Regardless of the mixed signals, American strategy remains the same as was previously commented on. Regime change through punishing the Cuban people so much that they would overthrow their own government. This latest hostility is simply the most recent example of US policy of siege against Cuba, going back to the early years of the revolution. My second book, shameless plug, Cuba Under Siege, was written 13 years ago, and it's just as important today as it explains the devastating impact of siege on every aspect of Cuban life, socially, economically, cultural, everything. A couple examples of the impact of siege. In healthcare, children are dying at the William Soler Hospital in Havana because the Cuban government cannot purchase specific medicines. Not that they don't have the money, but the blockade prevents them from buying the medication or equipment under current US patent laws. Immigration these days is driven so much by those leaving Cuba for economic reasons as a result of the siege. Dissidents are treated harshly but understandably by a government under siege, where in a besieged castle all dissent is treason. And the history is very extensive of the so-called dissidents working directly under American direction for financial gain. Also, Cuba has also had to protect itself from violent anti-revolutionaries. There was a recent terrorist attempt a month ago that shows this has not stopped. The siege is also having incredibly severe impact on food production. People are not starving, but there is acute food shortages. American policy prevents Cuba from accessing international monetary institutions that would provide the island with financing for fertilizers, pesticides, and modern agricultural equipment. So will America's latest attempt to end the revolution succeed? Don't bet on it, because there's been lots of examples in the past. In the early months of the new Cuban government, the United States successfully pressured almost every nation in the Americas not to trade with Havana. The only exceptions were, as were previously noted, Canada and Mexico. That pressure, the Americans thought, would surely mean the government would fall. It didn't. In 1961, the Americans sent an ill-trained group of mercenaries to overthrow Fidel Castro and his supporters and to end the revolution. The disaster at the Bay of Pigs did not achieve anything but the solidification of the socialist government. A year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis was to bring about the end of the revolution under America's absolute naval blockade. This certainly would be the demise of the revolution. It wasn't. So fast forward to 1989. The collapse of the Soviet Union combined with increased US hostility had the anti-revolutionaries in Miami and Washington simply counting the days that they'd be able to reestablish American hegemony. Cuba's spiral into the special period meant not if, but when the revolution would fail. This would finally be the termination of Fidel Castro and his government. It wasn't. Then COVID hit the island hard in 2020, and the nation's isolation meant loss of tourism, international business, and this time there would be no rescuing the revolution. Except it didn't need to be rescued, it just adapted. Now, however, Cuba is facing probably its worst existential threat with the Trump administration and his anti-Cuban extremists increasing the unrelenting economic hostility. Oil is stopped from Venezuela and Mexico. Tariffs are being threatened on other countries who want to sell petroleum to the island. Cuban-American politicians want to add to the misery by calling for the ending of remittances and stopping all commercial flights to Cuba. Cuba is at its most vulnerable, experiencing shortages worse than the special period. A humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding. No oil. No energy, no revolution. That's the latest American anticipation. Will it succeed this time? So Trump has made the embargo so much worse. He's imposed more punishment on Cuba than any other president. And the biggest lie of the blockade supporters is that the embargo is aimed at the Cuban government. It's not. The punishment is for the Cuban people still on the island. The US says it wants Cuba to change. No, they don't. What the US wants is complete surrender, to return to American control over the island. It's up to the citizens of Cuba to change things if they want to, not because a foreign power is telling them they have to. Trump is just the latest president to try for regime change through blockade and siege. No matter what you think of the Cuban government, the people don't deserve to be starved because of America's hostility towards the revolution. Now, Trump is threatening economic sanctions against any other country who wants to sell oil to Cuba. That's basically an act of war. If Canada wants to sell oil or give oil to Cuba, what would happen? America's policy is particularly hypocritical because they don't hand out the same punishment to other countries. Vietnam is communist, China is full of human rights violations, Saudi Arabia is a medieval monarchy, but the US has no problem with them. Cuba's crime was to establish self-determination and to end American control of the island. The US wants to reestablish that. Nothing Cuba would do would change America's desire to destroy the revolution. The problem with US when it comes to Cuba, as it always has been, is that the American politicians and the mainstream media simply cannot accept the reality that the majority of Cubans continue to object to a foreign power, any foreign power, dictating to them what type of social economic system they want. A lot of Cubans express the desire for changes from the government, maybe even to the extent of a fundamental alteration to the system they are living under. But for 60 years, those who continue to reside in Cuba make it clear they don't want to be told by the most powerful nation on earth that they must abandon their system or starve. While recognizing this is the worst it's ever been, there is still great confidence the revolution will survive. That attitude is recognized by many outside the country, including former Canadian ambassador to Cuba, Mark Entwistle, who said in a recent CBC interview, quote, "The Cubans are quite good planners, and they're survivalists. The Americans, of course, believe that they're about to fall and collapse in the ocean many, many times since 1959. My recommendation to policymakers in Washington is to assume nothing. Don't count them down, even though they are on the mat." To end with, I want to reiterate that American policy of siege since the beginning of the revolution is based on making things so bad for the Cubans that they'll overthrow their own government. We may be familiar with the most famous quote by a US government official that stated this officially. Lester Mallory in April 1960 said, quote, "Since most Cubans support Castro in the revolution, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship." He proposed, quote, "denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government." However, there was another exchange that brought this strategy of strangulation up to date. And I don't think many people may be familiar with this one. It happened in 2000, the year 2000, when the United States was fully normalizing relations with China, ending all trade restrictions with the country, and at the same time, the issue of the continuing blockade of Cuba came up. Republican Tom DeLay responded when he was asked, why not end the trade restrictions, why not end the embargo against Cuba at the same time you're normalizing trade restrictions with China? And he responded that we have not been turning the screws on him, Fidel, and screwing him down, Fidel, and putting pressure on him, Fidel, so that his people, the Cubans, will rise up and throw him out. After all, Cuba is not Eastern Europe. This is not the Soviet Union. This is a tiny island. The response to that statement came from New York Representative Jose Serrano, born in Puerto Rico, who said, "It finally happened. The last speaker let the cat out of the bag. Cuba is a small island, not a large European country." That's the problem. If it was a large European country or an Asian country, he would be lobbying, as he did, for free trade with Cuba, because he was the chief sponsor of lobbying on behalf of President Clinton for free trade with China. But he said, Cuba's a small island. We've been saying, you're a small island. You're insignificant. You speak another language. We are going to step all over you. It was never about what was right. It was about Cuba being a small island and China being a big country. To end, this may be the final punishment, that breaks the revolution. There's only so much external harm any society can withstand. If the United States finally succeeds, it would represent the victory of the mafia American empire over this small, stubborn nation. A return to 19th century colonialism and the reappearance of US hegemony over Cuba. It would also represent a complete failure of the international community to defend the rule of law. Cuba has never deserved what the United States has done to them. And those who are convinced this is the straw that will break the Cuba's back, don't underestimate the average citizen's continued belief in fighting for their nation's independence and right to self-determination. Maybe this time the revolution will end, I doubt it. But betting against the Cubans who continue to support it and what it represents has always been a losing proposition. For those who think the revolution will end, well, they're going to lose once again. The revolution will survive, as they have always done. And they sure as heck will survive far longer than the war criminal that's in the White House today. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let me begin with, on behalf of the Socialist Project, I want Cubans to know that we stand with you against this horrendous blockade, and we stand with you in resistance against the unprovoked, illegal blockade on Cuba, choking it in its very existence. To say that is really important because I don't know where Canada is at when it comes to Cuba, because it used to be that we had very strong relations with Cuba, very unique, very distinct from the U.S., but that has changed. And you know, it used to be that we had 1 million Canadians going to Cuba as tourists, and that has dramatically decreased, and people are choosing to go elsewhere to other beautiful places in Latin America. But Cuba is really suffering from those decisions that Canadians have made. I want to ask, did any one of you see the interview with President Miguel Diaz-Canel on Meet the Press, US program? Okay. Some of you have. It was a very good and interesting interview, and I suggest that you watch it because there is quite a bit of information there in terms of the position that the Cuban government's taking and why. So essentially, that Kristen Welker, who is the journalist who was interviewing President Diaz-Canel, asked and kept pressing him to admit, or at least to concede, that he might fall under the pressure by resigning and stepping away, because it's very clear that the Americans, or the Trump administration in particular, would like to see another Venezuela-type operation where they have regime change with very minimal military action, and that would be the ideal situation. So they are finding various ways to pressure that so that Trump can walk away by saying, hey, you know, we have regime change, we've accomplished what we wanted to accomplish in Cuba. And Diaz-Canel really pushed back. You know, he said, who is asking this question? Is this on behalf of the State Department or the Trump administration? Is it genuinely a question you're asking me? Because my answer is essentially that that decision was up to the Cuban people. If they wanted a change in the government or a change in the president, or if they wanted him to resign, that was up to the Cuban people and not the United States of America. So and also, I think it's very important that we hear as many Cuban voices as possible. That's why I was kind of checking the room to see who could possibly have this dialogue with us. The Cubans have been very smart in terms of putting a lot of people out there in the international press We just don't get it very much here in Canada. We don't hear from them. You have to watch Al Jazeera. You have to look at, Spanish language press in order to actually hear what the Cuban government is doing. They're masters at their diplomatic and media outreach. And they've been talking to a lot of the European countries, but you don't actually hear about it very much in the press. I also want to say that for those of you who don't know, I spent 5 years working for President Hugo Chavez's government, and part of our profile of a team of people that was working at Miraflores for President Chavez was to actually work with the Cubans on the diplomatic front, so at the United Nations and in Europe and with other countries. So my familiarity with Cuba is from that perspective. I spent quite a few months in Cuba over a period of 5 years. I worked for Chavez for about 5 years. So my take is from that angle of things, and I know that Cubans have one of the most sophisticated diplomatic officers and foreign relations units, and you would be shocked at how sophisticated they are and how much they're advising other Latin American countries, and even the larger ones like Brazil under Lula, would consult with the Cubans all the time. And so this blockade in particular, the fact that somehow the U.S., by abducting Maduro, who was really holding ground in terms of the aid that they were giving to Cuba, particularly oil, is a tremendous loss, not only financially, but that subsidizing the oil that Venezuela was giving Cuba, and removing Maduro was, perhaps the first step in that process, which is very sad to see. But one of the things that Diaz-Canel said in the interview is that, Cuba is strong. Cuba will resist. Cuba, for 67 years, have been under a blockade. So this is not something new to them, and they will resist. But I happen to think we, as a journalist, when you're reading what's going on and you're reading between the lines and you're reading what the negotiations are revealing, it's a pretty scary moment for Cuba. And I don't think we should underestimate it, no matter how strong the Cuban people are, how many years they have resisted a U.S. blockade. So I think that Cuba is in a very, very serious situation, and not enough support from other countries in terms of, holding the U.S. responsible or in accordance with international law. UN has been weakened to the point that it's fairly inactive. Year after year, they pass a resolution to end the blockade in Cuba. This year, or at least in 2025, it was the 33rd time the U.S. General Assembly had passed a resolution to end the blockade in Cuba, as saying that it was violation of international law, and it has fallen on deaf ears. And I think there has to be a real movement to muster the strength, because 137 countries signed that resolution. And the U.S. can just ignore it. And but there's strength there. There's such strength there that if the European Union as a collective would act, which they do usually, I think there could be a big shift on the pressure on the U.S. If Latin American countries could get together along with Canada and voice their concern at the OAS, or in a collective statement, it could make a big difference. I know that Sheinbaum in Mexico and Lula and a few other countries have come out and made statements, but they were individual. There's not a collective that could take a position and meet with the Americans, trying to pressure them both at the UN and then bilaterally as well. So I think there's a lot going on. Like if the BRICS countries together would take a position on it, that could have some strength. But some of these regional bodies really need to take a position. Now, I am totally dismayed at, given the previous and historic relations Canada has had with Cuba, that they're not taking a greater stand on Cuba. It's really surprising. Yes, but at the same time I understand the situation that the Canadians are in terms of the negotiations underway on tariffs and economic relations and dependency and all the things that Carney would be concerned about. But it also, given the historic relationship Cuba has had with Canada, it also gives them a very good position in terms of, look, we're not going to bend over and change and overhaul our whole foreign policy just because the Americans are pressuring us this way. I mean, if you were to listen to Carney's speech in Davos, or his recent release of independent, creating our own path as Canadians and economic policy and else, this would be consistent with that and consistent with our history. Because don't forget that not only, I don't know when you said Trudeau went to Cuba, whether you were talking about Justin Trudeau or the Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau was the first NATO country after the Cuban Revolution to go to Cuba, establish a relationship with Fidel. And so that was remarkable guts that isn't there now. And also after that, we all know that Fidel came here for Pierre Trudeau's funeral. This is not a good time to be critical or hold Cuba accountable under the circumstances. But I also think Cuba had missed a lot of opportunities in terms of strengthening the revolution, strengthening their capacity to rule, their own economic independence. Like, there's no reason in the world that Cuba isn't more energy sufficient, self-sufficient in terms of energy, because they have solar energy, they have some of the wind currents in the Caribbean are the strongest in the world. And I know this because we did some surveys for Venezuela and Cuba. And so in terms of, the renewable technologies that are available now and for the last 20, 30 years, as far as, from China and other places, they could have built a more sufficient energy grid. And so I question that, because I think they had the capability to do that by negotiating with China, and they have good relations with China. And also economically, where the diversification of their economy, just because the Soviet Union told them to, grow sugar and do sugar cane for the world, and not diversify their own economy and their own agriculture and their own food systems, for which they had a lot of the resources necessary. Fertilizer and becoming more self-sufficient. So there's a lot of questions about what they could have done in the last 67 years after the revolution that I would like, maybe you have some answers as to what impeded that, but dealing with them on a trade level, I feel like they had certain strengths that they weren't able to optimize, obviously for various reasons, but they could have, and I'm asking why not?
So we're going to have a session of questions and answers.
That's a really good comment. I'm glad you brought up Vietnam. So after the war in Vietnam, the United States had an embargo against that country as extensive as Cuba. In 1996, President Clinton lifted that embargo, and now Vietnam has favored trading nation status with the United States. When the embargo was under in Vietnam, they were going through exactly the same economic problems, civil rights restrictions, and now Vietnam, as far as I remember, is still a communist state with a one party, but they have been able to expand themselves economically at such a great pace once the embargo was lifted. The problem with Cuba, to date, they are still restricted from accessing international monetary institutions. Investment is completely restricted, not completely, is extremely restricted because of American extraterritoriality applications of the Helms-Burton Law. Cuba faces problems that no other country has faced, including Vietnam. But you're right, there's always opportunity, but certain things have to change.
I comment on the solar panels, and it's nothing like this kind of pressure to really change the way a country operates. The Cuban energy grid, which is 40% generated locally, yet some of it is dysfunctional because equipment's old and they haven't been able to get some of the parts that they need. For example, you need electricity to funnel water through a city, and they don't have it. So people are actually lifting the grids on the road and trying to get water out of the taps in different parts of the city. But anyway, I think you make a very important point, is this is expediting the change and change over to renewable energy. China is helping, apparently now shipping quite a few solar panels already built to China, to Cuba. And some of the countries like Spain, who's sending quite a bit of aid in that same ship that came from Russia with oil. I think there are things that are going to change in Cuba as a result. The Iranians found all kinds of ways to subvert the financial system and sell oil and get paid in dollars or yen or rubles. And so there are ways in which to operate in that system, and Iran's actually a master at it, so they can learn from that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I think it's really important to talk about, I think, like as it was mentioned, the diversification of the Cuban economy, whether or not Cuba should have taken those steps right after the revolution or throughout the 60s, 70s, before the collapse of the Soviet bloc, during the 90s, during the special period. And I think we can sit here and talk about it all day if we want, whether or not they did the right thing. But I think it's really important to focus on the steps that Cuba did take. And I think that the question of diversification was really came to the fore, especially during the special period, when a lot of their trade, their economic relations was with the socialist bloc. When that, when those relations dematerialized, and what were the Cubans supposed to do? I think they were the Cubans have been very honest about the discussions that happened during the special period, and that forced them to begin this kind of process of diversification of their economy. I was actually speaking to a Cuban 2 years ago. He was actually one of our guides. He works with ECAP, which is the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples. And his comment really hit me when he said that the blockade has forced us into certain choices, into certain decisions, and that as a result of the blockade, of the constraints put on the Cuban leadership and on the Cuban government by the blockade, that mistakes have been made. And the Cubans are very honest about it. They will speak to us about the mistakes that have been made. Maybe the lack of responsibility, maybe the lack of foresight, maybe the lack of ingenuity or thinking of something in a better way. But that doesn't justify then, this desire to overthrow socialism by the United States government. The blockade has forced them into certain options. They're not always the best, but sometimes they also have to think in the short term. So I think the Cubans show ingenuity not just in their technical application, but also in how they think about the future and how to produce that future and how to maintain the socialist system. Because, I mean, again, we could talk about this all day, the changes that happened in Vietnam and China, whether that constituted this or that. But I think Cuba particularly is very concerned in wanting to maintain its socialist system with the benefits that they have, but also in understanding that that's a system that they need to build, that it is not something that's already set, that it's not just we've got checked off every box, so we've arrived at the socialist utopia. For them, it's very much a process of building democracy in the workplace, of figuring out how to better incorporate the will of the people in larger decision-making and the decision-making of the entire nation, where production should go, where energy should go. These are things that the Cubans consistently discuss. But again, whether or not, diversification, that is something that they're trying. They are trying the solar panels, and actually they've made quite a big advancement in that. But I think we also need to understand that the blockade puts the Cubans in a certain position, that they are obligated sometimes to take certain choices, that they, again, we want the end of the blockade because we want to see what Cuba can achieve without a blockade. Look at all the stuff that they have achieved with a blockade. Imagine what Cuba could achieve without. Imagine the benefit to the world of a Cuba without a blockade. And that's why it's important to fight against the blockade, so that the Cubans can develop themselves, because that is what they want. They don't want to live consistently on aid or on a status quo of receiving donations. They don't want aid. They want to develop themselves. They want to have relations with countries so that they can take these opportunities to develop their economy and diversify.
I was wondering if you could comment also on the pharmaceutical factory you visited and how developed it is, because one of the agreements between Venezuela and Cuba was that Cuba was providing a lot of pharmaceutical products to Venezuela, where you didn't have to buy from Big Pharma, and you could put all kinds of very expensive pharmaceuticals on the shelves in Venezuelan stores because of the generic pharmaceuticals that Cuba produced, learned through. At the time, the Congress government in India was really helping Cuba develop their pharmaceutical industry. But I wanted you to talk about it, because he was actually at one of the factories.
So actually last year we were able to visit one of the main centers for the Cuban biomedical sector in La Habana. These are, so the government, unlike our governments here in the West, the majority of the government's GDP does go to social programs, but also specifically to medicine, to the development of the biomedical sector and everything. And actually, it's one of the greatest achievements of Cuba, and it was one of Fidel's biggest ideas as well, one of Fidel's biggest plans, was the development of the Cuban biomedical sector. He very much pushed for it in the late 80s, early 90s, and they have achieved quite amazing things. When we went there, they spoke to us as well regarding the blockade and how that affects their ability to develop their biomedical sector. Even with the blockade, they have able to make developments such as the Alzheimer's treatment that they're actually developing, which is actually quite revolutionary. The test results and the statistics coming out of the experimentation and the trials that they are currently doing with the Alzheimer's treatment is amazing. It's not just a treatment that prevents or halts the deterioration that folks can experience who suffer with Alzheimer's, but can actually improve conditions. That's something that, again, we haven't seen in Canada, and we can't take really benefit of, even in the United States, where people could really benefit from these types of trials and these types of medical programs because of the blockade. Again, even like there can't be this, because of the blockade and the sanctions and all of the pressure that the US puts on Cuba, there isn't the possibility of an exchange between scientific inquiring minds, where maybe the Cubans can teach our scientists and our doctors about the achievements that they have made in Cuba regarding medicine. They're actually able to develop a lot of they try to develop their own equipment. But again, one of the issues is the blockade. One of the main, and the blockade is a whole regime, it touches on many different things, but one thing I want to touch on is that Cubans are not allowed to import anything, any materials, any equipment with that has at least 10% components made in the US. So basically anything with at least 10% of its components made in the US cannot be sold to Cuba. Cuba cannot import it. A lot of medical equipment, machinery, medicine, all of that, a lot of it has subsidiaries or their parent companies are American, and so all of that affects Cuba's ability to bring that stuff in. But even with that, even with all that, they're still pushing their own medication. There's been one for diabetes particularly, which is cancer. There's been incredible developments in cancer treatment. But again, imagine what Cuba could achieve if it wasn't under a blockade. Imagine if they could get all of the equipment that they need to run their trials, to do the experiments that they need to do, and to share it with all of us, with the world, because that's what they want to do. They don't want to sell it at a profit. They don't want to be known as the country where, you know, they'll sell the medication for like 10 or 20 or 30 times the price just so they can make a quick buck off our pain and suffering. Actually, what they do is they want to share it with us, because again, they believe that all of us should benefit from those, from their achievements.
Thank you for your comments. It's a belief, it's a support system. I've been dealing with Cuba for 35 years now. I've seen them go through so much. This is the worst. This is absolutely the greatest test they're going to have. I just don't know what the alternative is. I don't think the Americans will come in and invade. The American strategy hasn't changed as far as imposing punishment and the blockade. So it's just, I can't think of an alternative. I don't want to think of an alternative. Cuba will adapt. Cuba has changed. There's so many Cuban Americans in Miami say, oh, Cuba has never changed. The Cuba of today is nothing compared to what the Cuba was 20 years ago. And the Cuba of 20 years ago is nothing compared to what it was in the 1960s. Cuba has always adapted. They're very pragmatic. They're very adept at dealing with crisis, and this is the worst one. So I have to hope that they'll overcome this. I don't have a specific route for them to do that. I just believe in the Cuban people and the government's support for what they're doing. The United Nations has been brought up a couple times. The United Nations vote every year, like we've said. It's overwhelmingly voting against the embargoes. Israel, United States, and the Solomon Islands. You know, this last year was Argentina. It's a non-binding vote. The Cubans appreciate it for public relations purposes, but it's meaningless. The Americans have said they won't recognize, they won't respect that, because they consider Cuba a domestic issue. Think about that. A domestic issue. So the Americans still haven't got it through their head. This is a sovereign, independent nation. They're still thinking pre-1959 when they owned the place. It's like Texas succeeds and they want to get it back. Well, Cuba isn't part of the United States, never has been. International solidarity, the economics, there's so many elements to that. You know, the Cubans have taken one hit after another. The lack of tourism from Canada is a huge hit. But for 60 how many years, the revolution survived, the revolution has evolved, the revolution has changed. They're going to change now. They have no choice. They will evolve. And hopefully, it will succeed. One last comment. Trump is a moron, an idiot, whatever. He's not driving Cuban policy. It's the Cuban Americans in Miami, the elected officials, Marco Rubio, Menendez, all these ones. Trump wanted to open a golf course and a hotel in Cuba. He doesn't know more. The mic is. It is working. Can you hear me? I can't hear you guys. So Trump is being led by the Cuban American mafia in Miami that thinks this is the final straw that will break the revolutionaries' back. I wouldn't bet it. I'm betting for the Cuban people.
Thank you for those very good questions, and also making that statement on, Cuba is a little island and it's not China and it's not Iran, and I think that's a very important realization that has to be considered here. But getting back to the issue of how Cuba can wield its power, when you have, I just checked the stats, so it was 165 countries at the United Nations at the General Assembly in 2005 voted in favor of ending the blockade and pressuring the U.S. to stop the blockade. And 7 countries voted against it, and there was 12 abstentions. But that's an enormous amount of power. And the abstentions came from Albania, Bosnia, Cuba, Costa Rica, Costa Rica, that's weird.
We've had a right-wing government. Yeah, they just kicked out the Cuban Costa Rica.
Czechia, Ecuador, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Morocco, and Poland. So those were the abstentions. Yeah, it's like
that many abstentions wasn't really.
Yeah.
That's how much the Americans were pressured.
Yeah, well, at the UN level, if people are abstaining, it's mostly because the US has bought them out or some deal has been made with them. As we remember from the Iraq War, when the Security Council was trying to pass resolutions, they literally bought some of the African nations, gave them money to vote with the US. So these are all very good points that need to be taken into consideration. In spite of that, I think Cuba is just so clever internationally in terms of their diplomatic strategies that they will be able to garner the support they need in order to bring some measures forward against the United States. And I think it needs to continue to do that, and it needs the support of countries like Canada to be able to do that. And I think in Latin America, you have Mexico, you have some large countries that support Cuba, and if we could get collective signatures and support, it'll carry more weight. So that's the work that needs to be done. Go ahead.
Just to finish up on your question, just so we can get to the other questions. What do I think? I'm not going to say there isn't going to be an invasion, or there is. I'd like to say that hopefully there won't be an invasion, even though the threats have been quite intense. And it's not the first time Cuba has faced many of these invasion threats before in the past. But Cuba is not like Venezuela. Venezuela, you had Juan Guaido and then Maria Corina Machado. That type of opposition, big opposition figures do exist in Venezuela. There is no such opposition figure in Cuba to take over. If in the eventuality of, or any thing like an invasion, there's no one that the Americans can put up. Okay, so any type of invasion to change the government would be an absolute quagmire for the Americans, and the Cubans will fight. The Cubans will fight back. I mean, they don't have an incredibly modern military force, which again is why the U.S. accusation that Cuba is a threat to the most powerful, in terms of military country in the world, this island that doesn't have, you know, all the types of weaponry that the U.S. has, is pretty much a lie. And then lastly, with the UN, it's basically U.S. pressure, because as we have noticed, like the number of countries that are against the blockade, which was quite high in even recent years, has started to decrease, and you have a lot more countries either abstaining or actually joining in the U.S. And not condemning the blockade. And again, it's all part of the U.S. attempt, because this was an embarrassment for the U.S. every year. The entire world was basically like, this is a terrible thing, and it's a violation of the rights of the Cuban people. So it was an embarrassment for the Americans, and this is part of the pressure that they have been putting on. But I would just like to remind folks that yes, Trump is, like, the most terrible sanctions that are happening right now are happening under the Trump administration, but that this is a continuation of policy by both Republican and Democratic administrations in the US. Trump put Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list in his first administration, and Joe Biden had the opportunity to go back to the policy that Obama had started of opening up to Cuba. And what did Joe Biden do? He didn't do anything. Instead, he kept them and increased the pressure on Cuba, and that Trump then was allowed to continue in this administration. I mean, Joe Biden, like, removed Cuba on his very last day in office, which is great because it lasted for exactly 24 hours. And it was gonna happen. And yeah, absolutely, he knew it was gonna happen. But again, it was a show of, you know, oh yeah, actually, no, I never actually thought about Cuba that way. And again, yes, Trump is terrible, but this is not a policy of one man. It is a policy of the United States government, and has been their policy for the past 65 years. So I just want to make clear that it's not one person, and it's not, and yes, the Cuban-American lobby in the United States has a lot of pressure on it. And I can point to the Organization of American States' most recent human rights report from their human rights, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission or whatever, that the main issue for the OAS was human rights in Cuba. And that the Cubans were violating, apparently they had, the claim is that there's thousands of political prisoners in Cuba. And that's the biggest issue right now in Cuba. When one of the main people who's writing this is actually Rosa Maria Paya, who's a famous Cuban-American activist of the right-wing sort, whose main goal is to, again, put pressure on Cuba and on the Cuban people through any institution in any way, in shape or form that the U.S. can find. And again, it's to overthrow the Cuban government, because the U.S. doesn't like that other people have decided to, you know, take their future and their country and their nation to their own hands, instead of selling it off to the U.S. So I think it's really important to take that into consideration. It's about, you know, what can Canadians do? Yes, someone over there asked the question. Thank you so much for that question. Really quickly, join the CCFA, Canadian-Cuban Friendship Association. You can find us online. We also have a lot of printed material over by our table. We have books, we have shirts. You want to buy one of these shirts? They're really nice. They have really great stuff written on the back. Mine says, Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba yes, no to the blockade. We also have it in English. But join a Cuba organization. In order to be in solidarity with Cuba, we have to organize. We can't do a one-person army of going to Cuba and giving them aid. I mean, I really appreciate folks who would do that, but we are stronger together. So that means getting educated about Cuba. So the first thing is to learn about Cuba. In order to be in solidarity with Cuba, we gotta know about Cuba. Learn about Cuba. We have a lot of information about Cuba. Keith's books. There's also books in the back. We have Cuba Unspun. Again, more books, learn about Cuba, learn about the blockade, so you are able to go and advocate for Cuba. To show solidarity, you can join an organization that does solidarity work. Come and join our rally tomorrow at 1 p.m. outside of the U.S. Consulate on University Avenue. We're there every single month. We would love more and more people to join us. We also have campaigns to pressure our representatives to bring up Cuba, because they need to mention Cuba in Parliament. They need to ask the government why they aren't doing enough. Why are they doing more? Why are we investing so much in weapons and in the militarization of our society and not on helping countries that are suffering inhuman and illegal genocidal blockades? That's what we need to be pressuring our representatives on. And so we also have, there's a lot of petitions. Exactly. We actually recently had a petition. I think actually the deadline has passed to sign it, but we did have a petition to bring up, Cuba in Parliament, to ask the Canadian government why they aren't doing enough, to ask the Canadian government to send oil and other aid to Cuba. So we need to learn about Cuba. We need to organize around Cuba. We need to go out to our own organizations. If you're part of a labor union, have your labor union come out in solidarity with Cuba. If you're part of any other organization, have them join the Canadian Network on Cuba. Canadian Network on Cuba is the large umbrella national organization that coordinates solidarity efforts. And actually, part of the donations that we're collecting here today is to go to the CNC's campaigns to get energy materials and other aid to Cuba. So we need to learn about Cuba. We need to educate ourselves about Cuba to be able to defend Cuba. And we need to organize around Cuba, because Cuba has organized for us. And we should show the same type of solidarity with them. But additionally, it doesn't matter, like, Cuba doesn't need to show us that they deserve our solidarity. We should be in solidarity with any people suffering genocide and imperialist aggression. And that's Cuba, that's Palestine. So some of the largest, biggest sponsors and scholarship providers for Palestinians to study medicine is Cuba. We actually went to ELAM, that's the Latin American School of Medicine, where they take so many Palestinians for free. So they can learn in Cuba and take that knowledge and that experience back to Palestine. That's how Cuba shows solidarity. So we should be able to make the same efforts, make the same sacrifices for the world as Cuba has.
Can I just say?
I just want to share with you all that this event has been made possible because a group of Chilean of the first generations that arrived got together and pushed Casa Salvador agenda and said, what are we doing about Cuba? So most of you are here sitting, so a big applause to all of you for that initiative. And this is exactly what Nico is saying. Like, if you belong to other groups, let's have more conversation. I'm sure that Kit will be happy to participate.
When the Canadian Airlines start flying back to Cuba, hopefully in the fall, go to Cuba.
That's a very important intervention. I think that's one. But when you have 165 countries signing Stop the Blockade at the UN level, I think a country like Canada, who likes to move in collectively with Europe often, as they have, when the tariffs were slammed on Cuba, Carney got on a plane and went to Europe, and his first visit was to the UK, and then he went to India and China. So when there is reason to act collectively with other countries like you have here, I think Canada could take some steps. I know you're saying, John, that because of the jobs and it's a very tentative situation and so on. But Carney going to China was a big move Carney going to India was a big move, but China in particular, because the U.S. is particularly peaked with China at the moment. So if he can do that, I don't see why he can't take a tiny step forward with other 165 countries and do a collective action. I think if you get if you get Canada, Mexico, Brazil, some of the Caribbean countries, and Canada all working together can you imagine escorting a flotilla type exercise, but with the navies of these countries escorting aid? I mean, Mexico had a lot of guts. They sent a ship of aid to Cuba, and so I think if they can do it, certainly Canada can.
I mean, regarding how we can get more cooperation between the states of our region, of Nuestra America, as we like to say in the south, of our America, I think it's, again, really important to put pressure on the governments of the region. And again, it's the reason why there's been such an attack on countries that support Cuba, from the voting at the UN, to the sending of oil, to the sending of other types of aid, or even just having medical brigades. I mean, most of us are aware of the effect of the sanctions threats on countries that had medical brigades. Actually, there was a heartbreaking video that I saw, I believe it was from Honduras, where it was the Cuban medical brigades that had been serving these incredibly poor communities in Honduras, where even Honduran doctors don't usually work, but the Cubans will, and they saw them crying. The Cuban doctors were crying, and the people of the community were crying because they were losing the only access they had to medical care. Because the United States does not like that Cuba sends medical brigades to other countries to help them. Cuba has for long sent these brigades, but in the past few years, the United States has been pushing this narrative that it's forced labor or whatever they like to say about that, just because they don't understand how that system actually works, and that the doctors do actually get paid. Part of that salary actually goes back to the government, because the government then takes that way of getting that money, and then reinvests it into the medical system, into hospitals, into paying for medicines and other things that hospitals need. So it's part of a big system that, again, in a country like Canada, or any capitalist country, the conception that you would actually make these sacrifices for the betterment of society might seem really strange, because it might seem like, why don't you just give me my whole salary and I decide where it goes? For Cubans, it's not like that. For Cubans, they've developed a system where everyone helps each other out. That's one of the main things we saw when visiting Cuba, the desire to help us out at all times, even knowing that we weren't Cubans. There was a girl that was afraid that she was having a medical issue, had to go to a Cuban doctor, was afraid that she might have had to pay for medicine with money that she didn't have. And the Cubans were like, no, that's all right. You don't have to pay for the medicine. We'll give it to you. And let's say, this is what the doctor said. Even if you had to have paid the medicine, I would have paid it for you. This is the type of solidarity that Cubans show at all times. And this is from everywhere, from every corner. I mean, from Havana to Matanzas, Pinar del Rio, Trinidad, Santiago de Cuba. Everywhere you go in Cuba, Cubans are incredibly, yes, in solidarity. But I guess to go back to the point of this question, we have to pressure our governments, really pressure. We have to show, and how do you pressure governments? You organize. You have to organize with your labor unions, with your student unions, with your neighborhood associations. Any type of organization that you're involved with should be pushing for Cuba right now, and that helps us push for something like a cooperation between Canada and Mexico in order to be able to do that. I know Sheinbaum has said that she's going to send oil soon, or that they're making preparations. But again, it's the threat of the sanctions. We need to fight that. We need to push our governments to have a backbone and stand up to the sanctions threat. And if they want to sanction us, well, then that's something that maybe we can take. Hey, the Cubans have dealt with a blockade for 65 years. Maybe Canada is all right with dealing with some sanctions. You know, I know it's a hard thing to push, but it's something that, hey, if we're gonna show solidarity, let's actually show solidarity, and that's making sacrifices.
Can we have a round of applause for everyone here for coming?